Hi, my name is James Andriella, and you're listening to the Back to Human podcast. Today's guest has quite the resume. He's a man of many titles and backgrounds with a career spanning across fields like environmental engineering, defense, space technology, and medical innovation. Sam Shepard holds 44 US and international patents with work ranging from cancer therapeutics and neurodegenerative disease treatment to wastewater remediation and carbon capture. He's developed systems used in the 2008 the Olympics, contributed to DARPA projects, consulted on lunar technologies, and even built the first AI tool for hazardous materials regulations back in 1989. Today, we'll be diving into Sam's experience with a rare form of bone cancer and how this led him to create his product, ValAsta. Without further ado, Sam, welcome to the show, brother.
Thanks, James. Thanks for the opportunity.
So, can you share with my audience what your experience with cancer was? What was your cancer diagnosis, and how did that set you up on this trajectory?
Yeah, prior to 2003, I was having some real problems with blood pressure spikes. And for the longest time, they were testing me thinking it was cardiovascular disease, but all that came back negative. And then in September of 2003, I was diagnosed with an incurable bone cancer, blood cancer called polycythemia vera. And it's a cancer. There is no chemo, no radiation treatment. Only a few people actually have that type of disease. And I may have gotten a little too close to something I shouldn't have gotten close to. But, anyways, I ended up with it and was told that my life expectancy in my current state was 10 minutes to 10 years. 97% of the people would perish within 10 years. And I asked him about 10 minutes, and he said, "Your blood is so thick that you could throw a blood clot to your brain, your heart, or your lung right now, and it would take me 10 minutes to declare you dead." So off to the hospital I went, and I was phlebotomized. The only way they could keep me alive was every month I would go in and they would remove my hemoglobin. And I did that every month for 4 years, and it got old. My blood pressure at times would spike to 280 over 160, couldn't get it down. Um, I would go in, they would knock me down to get my blood pressure down and um, remove my blood, and it was managed. That's how it was managed. But I knew that I was probably going to throw a blood clot and be disabled or dead. And the disabling portion of it, I'd seen people with strokes, and I didn't really want to be that much of a burden on my family. I knew what the outcome was. So I, one very dark morning, about 4 o'clock in the morning, God and I got really close during that time. And it just came to me that there's got to be some animals, plants, or something on this planet that doesn't get cancer. And I had access to ProQuest, all the government databases with my ID. And so I had access to pretty much at that time, this was um, in 2006, 2007, to all the knowledge that the Department of Defense knew about. So I ended up finding this research that was done by several universities, and Scripps Oceanographic was involved. The 5 animals that apparently don't get cancer that I found: salmon, pink flamingos, sharks, elephants, and naked mole rats. And since then, we now know shrimp and lobsters don't get cancer. But at that time, those were the only 5. So did some research, found out through Scripps uh, um, that they could analyze every molecule in the tissue of all those animals. And I had requested that they look for those molecules that weren't supposed to be in any of those 5 species, and yet was found in all five. And I didn't know whether it would go anywhere or not, but they came back about 4 months later and they said they found a molecule that shouldn't be in any of them, but is found in all of them. And I said, "What's that?" And they said, "It's astaxanthin." And I said, "What's astaxanthin?" And they said, "Well, it's a molecule produced by an algae called Hematococcus pluvialis. It's a green algae that turns red when it's stressed. So when its pond is beginning to dry out and the salt content begins to increase, that triggers a mechanism in the algae for it to know that its pond is drying out and the ultraviolet lights of the sun's going to kill that algae. So it produces this astaxanthin as a UV anti-tanning barrier so that when its pond dries out, it can lay in the soil for 100 years waiting for the next rainfall. When the next rainfall comes, it recysts, reforms, and life goes on. So that was the key to that algae. So when I found that out, you may have seen these Entex blow up hot tubs. I call them hillbilly hot tubs. You can get them at Walmart. You can get them, but you just put air in them and they blow up. And it has a heater and everything on it. Well, I went and got one of those, and then went to the University of Texas and got the algae species, which they have a library of over, I think, 3,300 algae species. And I began growing it in my backyard in Houston, Texas. And I would float the algae out. I stressed it. I knew how to make it go from green to red at a very efficient way. And I would float it out, put it in a dehydrator, and I knew it was 3.8% astaxanthin content inside the algae biomass. So I'd put it in my eggs in the morning, equivalent to whatever dose I wanted to do. So I started out at 4 milligrams per day, and I just arbitrarily set it there because it was close enough to the 3.8. And it made the calculation a little easier. So I began doing that, and after about 3 or 4 months, my hemoglobin wasn't climbing out as fast. So instead of being phlebotomized once a month, now I was being phlebotomized once every 2 months. So I thought, okay, statistically, it's not significant, but at least it's going in the right direction. And the red algae isn't poisoning my kidneys or my liver or causing any other damage. So I tripled the dose, went to 12 milligrams per day. And my phlebotomies got pushed out to once every 4 months. Statistically, that was significant. So now I had 3 curves. I had no astaxanthin, 4 milligrams, and 12 milligrams. I had the slopes of those curves. So now I could calculate how much do I have to take so that I'm never phlebotomized for the next 50 years of my life. I was 53 at the time, so I was anticipating living to be 103. But for the next 50 years, and that's the way the mathematics worked out. It turned out to be 96 milligrams per day. So I started taking 100 and my cancer ended. No more phlebotomies. My blood became normal. I was having a little bit of arthritis, stiffness in the fingers. All that went away. I have no joint pain. Um, I'm 72 years old and I have absolutely nothing. Um, so I needed to know why it worked. So many times we hear people say, well, try this dinitro terrible in your diet. I don't know how it works, but boy, does it work. Well, as a biochemist, that never sets well. I need to know why it worked. And it took me 8 years to figure it out. So during that 8-year period, I lost 2 family members because I wouldn't give it to them. Just didn't know enough. One was 29 years old, which I have to live with for the rest of my life, I guess. But um, at the end of that 8 years, I not only was able to figure out why it worked, I was also able to figure out what caused it, and also the 4, possibly 5 reactive oxygen species that we accumulate in our bodies that cause 92% of all inflammatory diseases. That was a major breakthrough. and it was uh, received with a lot of skepticism early on. So we didn't do any sales or marketing of this product. But anyways, the astaxanthin that I took um, out of the algae itself, which I found out later, is in the form of a glucosidic or liposomal form. What that means is that if this is the astaxanthin molecule, on the very end of it, there's a glucose molecule chemically attached to it. So it's floating around like this. And that's what I was taking, and that's what was working. Well, as a chemical engineer, I get very clever and I think, okay, if I can get the pure form of the astaxanthin, that should work even better. So I did what's called a CO2 supercritical extraction. So you put it under high pressure and you dissolve the astaxanthin out of the algae cell and you get very, very pure astaxanthin. Well, in that process, you crack off this glucose molecule. You end up with the pure astaxanthin molecule. So I would take that, dissolve it in olive oil, and I would take it. Well, my cancer came back. And I kept increasing the dose from 100 milligrams all the way up to a little over 800 milligrams before I could turn the rate at which my hemoglobin was climbing out. So I had to take 8 times more of the pure material than I did of eating the algae biomass itself. So that really set me off as to what did I do to change that chemical structure. And what then we found in the algae itself, it's in the form of a glucosidic or a glycosidic. There's means the same thing. So there's a glucose molecule attached to it. So I took the pure astaxanthin and through other work that I had done in bioweapons development, I knew how to put a glucose onto some pretty nasty organic molecules. So I did the same thing with this, and I attached that glucose onto the astaxanthin. That became ValAsta. So it's the only patented glucosidic astaxanthin in the world right now. So I began taking that, and my hemoglobin stopped climbing out. When we began to give it to people with cancer, also had Parkinson's tremors, for example, or type 2 diabetes. It doesn't work on type 1s, but it does work on type 2s. Their Parkinson's tremors went away. So back into the research I would go to figure out why in the world is this working with Parkinson's? Why is this working with type 2 diabetes? People are being required to get off of their metformin or their insulin or glucophage, whatever it is they're taking, because their blood sugars are becoming normal again. So we ended up finding that out. And I've written several papers on how that works too, and it stops what's called insulin resistance. Then, um, and we still were not advertising. In my line of work, I didn't need that type of negative publicity in my life. I knew it wasn't gonna be taken well. I wanted to stay under the radar as best I could until we finally had it at a critical point. So, we just relied on the testimonials of people who were cured of stage 4 cancers. They told everybody. When you're sent home with hospice with 2 to 4 months or 3 to 6 months to live or less than a year to live, and all of a sudden your cancer goes away in 30 days, you tell the whole world, and that's what they did, and it went completely around the world. We, um, have distribution in Dubai, Cairo, in England, in Poland, in Australia, in Southeast Asia, just by word of mouth and this social media thing. When I grew up, we didn't have this kind of marketing or advertising tool, but oh my golly, it just took off. And when people see someone that they knew or thought was dying of these diseases, and all of a sudden they're back. Um, so from a timeline point of view, in 2013, we gave it to a lady who was sent home with hospice from MD Anderson with inflammatory breast cancer. And she came to a party in Mississippi. I was there. she come up to me and she said that she would be willing to try this. Well, we were doing this at the Navy Yard in Charleston, South Carolina at the time, and there wasn't supposed to be any publicity about it. We didn't want any word out until we knew exactly how this was going to behave. And she come to me and she said, "I'm in the second month of a 4-month life expectancy." And she said, "How much can you spare?" I said, "I don't know what dose to give." And she said, "Well, how much do you have?" And I said, "I can do 3,000 milligrams a day from our production just in at the Navy Yard." And she said, "Well, I'll do that." And I went, "Well, I've never done that. I don't know what it's gonna do to you." And she grabbed me with her hands on my cheeks, and she said, "I have no other choice." So, we gave it to her, and she had a tumor 2 tumors in her brain, huge lesion and tumor on her breast, and 4 or 5 tumors in her colon. And in 42 days, the tumor in her brain, they couldn't find. 48 days later, all of her there was no cancer. The lesion had healed over on her breast. She had some scar tissue from where it broke out, but MD Anderson couldn't find any cancer in her and was shocked. And they called it a miraculous remission. And I had told her not to tell anyone at that time what she was taking. Well, she called me and she said they pulled all kinds of blood samples. They'd never seen a remission like this. And And I asked her, I said, "Did you tell them what you were doing?" And she said, "No." She said, "I didn't." But she says, "You need to tell them. They think it's something that they did that did this, but they don't know what it was." I said, "No." I said, "We're better off just to be happy with your life and just get on with your life." Well, they ended up calling her back and they found this molecule in her bloodstream that wasn't in previous blood samples. So she called me back and she said, "I think the gig's up." She said, "I think they found something." She said, "You need to call them." I said, "No, I'm not calling 'em. If they wanna call me, they can call me." So, one of the pathologists at MD Anderson called me and wanted to know what this was. I told him, and his first comment to me set me off. He said, "Where'd you get your medical license?" And I just sort of chuckled, and I said, "No, I'm a researcher." He said, "Oh, so you're not a prescribing doctor?" And I said, "No." So he said, "You're prescribing medicines." I said, "This is no medicine. This is like telling somebody to eat bananas. This is a natural product." He said, "No," he said, "This is this is a drug." And I said, "No, it's not a drug." And I said, "I tell you what," I said, I know where this is going." And I said, "I need your name, your address, and your bank account number." He said, "What do you need that for?" I said, "Because I'm going to sue you for everything you have ever made and will ever make for the rest of your life." He said, "What gives you the authority to do that?" I said, "Under the First Amendment." I said, "I'm a researcher. This is called freedom of information. This is research. You cannot interfere. No government agency can interfere with my right to do research." And he hung the phone up. Never heard back from him. So I've sort of weathered the storm now. So that's sort of how we got to this point. Sued twice, but end up winning both of those cases, one from the state of Oregon and then a complaint filed in the state of Texas for practicing medicine without a license. But I'm a researcher. So
Okay.
I won it under the First Amendment. Um, and then in April of 2019, I was asked to do a presentation in Washington, D.C., and there were senators, representatives. Um, all 5 of the major hospitals were there: John Hopkins, Mayo, Cleveland Clinic, Sloan, and MD Anderson. And it went on for about 2 hours, and I detailed exactly what my findings, 8 years of research had found as to what causes human disease. I found the 4 precursors to inflammatory diseases like cancer, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, arthritis, irritable bowel. And those 4 free radicals were the free radicals that are neutralized by the ValAsta. Typically, we have cellular antioxidants that we produce for men up to about age 50 called glutathione, catalase, and superoxide dismutase. Those are cellular antioxidants that we produce. But after the average age of 42 in women and 50 in men, we no longer produce those. Nature cuts that production off or reduces it dramatically in most individuals. And that's why we get these age onset inflammatory diseases. So that's what I found. And um, then in December of 2019, timing wise, hanging Christmas lights in my front yard, about 4 inches, and only because I moved back to check a plug on my Christmas lights at the same moment the shot was fired, came out of the woods across the street. I can actually show you the pictures of it. Blew the fence up right in front of me. The bullet went. I had my lights in my left hand and was hanging around the top post, and the lights went out. I always have them on because invariably I blow a bulb or it comes unplugged or something. So my lights went out, and I reached back to the plug, and when I did, is at the same moment he shot, and the bullet came underneath, blew up my fence. And at first, I thought my lights blew up in my hand. I couldn't figure out what that was, but I got wood chips, and then I heard the shot across the street come from the woods about, I don't know, 30, maybe 30 yards away. And I jumped behind a truck and hid there and yelled up to stop shooting. And I wanted to look around the truck, but I didn't. So I took off running for the house, called the sheriff. There's a police report filled out on it. And then they contacted the FBI. The FBI contacted me, and they pretty much knew my previous background. And at first, I thought it was somebody hunting up there, but the ballistics came back as a 223 round, um, probably fired from an AR. But when the cops came, he put a wire in the bullet hole that went through the fence, and it pointed up into the woods. So he pulled his weapon and walked up in the woods, and he found where somebody was laying in a big piled up group of leaves. And there was a boot print there, so they were able to figure out that it was obviously somebody laying in wait. But um, the FBI gave me the best advice I could ever have, and that was, you've got to go public with everything that you've discovered. It's bad for business, but that's what I did. So I did over 100 videos on why this works. So taking me out no longer matters. The gig's up, the information's
Mhm,
out there, and Sun Tzu is right in The Art of War. You just outflank them as best you can.
mhm, mhm,
And I've had no problems since. I haven't had any legal uh, attacks, no physical attacks, nothing. It ended. So far so good, but taking me out can't stop this now. We're in 37 countries, all 50 states. We have distributorships. Um, the results are amazing. The NIH has over 1,000 peer-reviewed articles on it, I think trying to prove me wrong, which is okay from a science perspective. It's called the null hypothesis, but they ended up proving me right, and that um, we now have a blood test called the HSCRP, where we can measure your predisposition to get a disease. And now we can knock that down. If we get that under 3 milligrams per liter, you won't get these inflammatory diseases.
mhm,
That was a major breakthrough. It set the entire pharmaceutical world on its ear. And all of this appears to have been known by big pharma, but they only want to treat the symptoms of disease. There's no money in a cure or a prevention. And that was the struggle. And that's, I think, why they came. Not only me, the FBI agent said he was aware of 17 individuals who really suspicious reasons as to why they were found dead. But um, he just told me I was lucky and that
To say the least.
and that I shouldn't take it personal. I thought that was humorous.
Jeez. So you were a ticking time bomb. You could collapse pretty much at any point. You became an N of one. You were a little concerned at first with sharing it with others, which rightfully so. You don't really know what it's going to do or why it's having an impact. And you gave this mega dose to this woman who saw remission in her breast cancer and also in the brain tumors.
Hmm.
When you were first starting out, why were you cautious with this dose if you only saw positive? So, did you ever experience a point of diminishing returns with how much you took where it could actually lead to bad side effects, or did you get any side effects, period, or no
No
side
side
effects?
no side effects at all. The only side effect that we've been able to document, and the NIH has also, is your stool will be red. It's called spillover. So if your body maxes out on the amount it can absorb, it just is flushed out with your fecal matter. So your stool may be red. This is a deeply red molecule. So you'll see it in your stool. And what we like to tell people is we definitely want to see red in your stool. Well, some people took it literally and sent me pictures of the stool. Don't do that. But just look and see if it's not red, that means you're in a highly stressed condition and your body is taking in all of this to offset the hydroxyl or the peroxyl free radical that's generating as a result of your oxidative disease state. Um, from a diet perspective, there's certain things that cause these ROS, these reactive oxygen species. And there's superoxide, singlet oxygen, the peroxyl non-radical, and the hydroxyl free radical. And then there's a RNS, a reactive nitrogen species, a nitrile. So there's five, but these four cause 92% of most inflammatory diseases. So from where do these come from? Well, anytime you process sugar in your mitochondria, all the OH molecule um, uh, functional groups on a sugar molecule get cracked off. Those OHs become the hydroxyl free radical. And if you don't have the superoxide or the glutathione or the catalase to neutralize those in the mitochondria, they're going to wreak havoc. They're going to steal an electron from anything they bump into. Now, typically, they'll cross the nuclear envelope and bump into your DNA and extract an electron from your DNA. That causes misfolding of your DNA. It's called a mutation, a DNA mutation. That's the first thing that happens with cancer is that DNA mutation. We now know what causes it. So it becomes a probability game. The lower I can get those hydroxyl free radicals, the less probability there is of you ever getting a unmitigated DNA damage. So we have three DNA repair mechanisms: PARP1, PARP2, and BRCA. And if the DNA is damaged to a small extent, those three enzymes will go down and repair the DNA. If you're PARP1, PARP2, or BRCA negative, that's usually a bad sign because any DNA that mutates is probably going to result in a higher probability of you getting cancer. That's why triple negative breast cancers are extremely difficult to get under control because genetically those people are probably PARP1, PARP2, or BRCA negative. So, what we want to do is focus on the cause of these diseases, the elimination or management of those four free radicals. And that's what the ValAsta does.
And you mentioned that those free radicals are mainly produced by an ingesting sugar. Is that refined sugar or is that just
Yeah,
a high carbohydrate diet, period?
yeah. The Let's talk about sugars because heavy metals can be an important play. Insecticides, anything that generates a inflammatory response. The
Mhm.
vaccine. People who took the vaccine created a huge inflammatory response because in the mitigation of your immune system trying to mitigate that damage, the immune system generates these free radicals. So, in the act of trying to stop a disease, you're increasing your inflammatory disease state. That's why we get a fever when we get a cold. That's overactive immune system, and that can be just as deadly because it generates such a high concentration of these free radicals. Um, in the so, in the sugar discussion, glucose is used by every cell in your body. It's the primary energy source for every cell. Fructose can't be used by a single cell in your body. Fructose is a poison, whether it's found in fruit or it's found in high fructose corn syrup or it's found in honey, doesn't make any difference. The fructose molecule, when you ingest it, is the primary source of inflammatory disease. About 67% of all inflammatory diseases are directly related to fructose intake. Now, table sugar is made up of glucose attached to a fructose molecule. So when you take in large amounts of sucrose, table sugar, you're taking in about 50% of that molecule is fructose. Fructose is the one that causes disease. And I'll explain how that got into our food system a little later. So fructose has to go to the pancreas. It causes uh, a pretty interesting inflammatory response in the pancreas. It causes the pancreas, it doesn't secrete insulin, but it causes an enzymatic inflammatory response to process that fructose. So the pancreas converts fructose into triglycerides. They used to call it the COPS disease because COPS always had a problem maintaining their triglyceride level and their LDL cholesterol levels. That was always the thing that kicked out on their physical was those two components. But fructose increases the triglyceride level, doesn't increase your insulin outtake. It's converted into tags or triglycerides. Now, the reason it was called the COPS disease because the cops spent too much time in donut shops. That was always the joke. But now your triglyceride level, when it hits about 400 nanograms per liter in your bloodstream, your liver takes that triglyceride and converts it into LDL cholesterol. Cholesterol does not come from animal fats or tallow or oils. Certain oils it can aggravate, but we they've they've told us wrong, and this is textbook stuff. I taught this. I taught biochemistry to pre-med students in Houston. This is all known chemistry. So the fructose goes into the pancreas, and pancreas converts it into triglycerides. Triglycerides are then converted by the liver into LDL cholesterol, which raises the bad cholesterol levels. So you can cut out all the animal fat you want, but if you haven't taken fructose or fruit out of your diet, you're going to maintain those high cholesterol levels.
Hmm.
So I'm not concerned when we say sugar, I'm not concerned about the glucose, but glucose will, increase your insulin levels. It's a good idea just to get it down because metabolically we don't process it well. Um, or the excess we don't process well. Now, if you're exercising and you're burning 5,000 calories a day, that's the primary source of our energy. But if you're sedentary, sitting in front of a TV, and you eat a Danish, that sugar is immediately converted into fat, and that's the problem. So it's energy storage at that point. But whether it's DDT, whether it's heavy metals, whether it's so think of it as a big tree. The root structure is the causes in our environment that cause disease. So you have a diet, you have chemicals, you have environmental exposure, you have um, Roundup, you have fructose, you have physiological stress. people who are worry a lot or in high anxiety and they're producing a lot of epinephrine or norepinephrine, that has to be processed. That creates an inflammatory response, by the way. That's why worry will kill you. If you spend too much in an anxious world, your CRP will go off the chart. And that's a sign that you're generating disease from your own anxiety. That's how it works. So all of these things down here in the roots all funnel up through the trunk of the tree. And the trunk of that tree is ROS, ROS, reactive oxygen species. So all of these things down here in the roots end up pumping reactive oxygen species in the form of superoxide, singlet oxygen, peroxyl, or the hydroxyl free radical up into the branches of the tree. Well, doctors, and that creates the symptoms of disease are the branches. Doctors only treat the tips of the branches. They're not focused on cutting the tree down at the trunk, getting rid of the ROS. Once the ROS is eliminated, the whole disease canopy collapses. That's what we have found. And that's why this has taken off with such a zeal that I've worked on a lot of things in my life. And I got to tell you, this wasn't a career for me, but it was amazing how well this worked. And nobody has come back and countered anything. As a matter of fact, if you go now and just search NIH and astaxanthin and whatever disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, irritable bowel, Crohn's, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, MS, in that line search, all of the research papers are now published. And the support for this is amazing, and it's gonna upset a lot of people. I know with what Bobby Kennedy Jr. is doing with his MAHA, he's on the right path, but he's not aware of the cause of human disease. I can go drink alcohol all I want. Alcohol is processed the same way as fructose. So if you drink a lot of alcohol, you're going to end up with the same sort of inflammatory response. But I enjoy life, so I'll have a glass of wine periodically, but I watch my HSCRP. My HSCRP gets above 2.5, I cut back. Or I increase my dose of ValAsta. That's the other thing that can be done. But I keep it below 3. And below 3, there's no more arthritis. It doesn't fix mechanical causes of pain. So if you have had arthritis for a long period of time and you've got bone on bone type deterioration, this works on the inflammatory side of that, not on the mechanical joint bone on bone type stuff, but works really well on on getting that HSCRP under 3 milligrams per liter. That's the key. That's the blood test we now have. Doctors, it used to be a standard part of our blood work until about 20 years ago. And when doctors began to run it, I can remember a doctor telling me, he said, you must be under a lot of stress because your CRP is high. Well, everybody's CRP is high. We're all in an extremely stressed environmental, food, diseased state. So they just stopped running the test because they had no medicine to prescribe to stop that inflammation. So they waited until a disease presented itself because then they could treat the disease. So they allowed people to get sick. And that's the problem I have with the healthcare program right now. I've seen it. I know how it works. I know what remuneration bias is. I know what chemotherapy does. I know what radiation does. That increases the inflammatory disease state. So it sort of pushes the cancer back a little bit, but they've just given you an inflammatory disease state that in 5 years, you got an 87% chance of representing with a new form of cancer.
Mm.
This is a vicious cycle, and it's got to be broken. And I hope um, HHS can do that now. Is break that cycle.
In the meanwhile, the major reason why I produce this podcast is so that people are exposed to more information like this, and hopefully they become more autonomous. Like you had to do, you took control over your life. You literally grew this algae in your backyard in order to fix what you were dealing with. And I found it interesting that you mentioned, I'm taking so many notes, by the way. I have
Mm.
notes everywhere right now. So this is amazing. So I know that fructose converts into triglycerides, as you mentioned. Then you
Yeah,
mentioned that alcohol metabolizes the same way. So someone that's, say, for instance, fruitarian, and they're young, they're able to get away with this, but they're lean. They don't exactly look like they're packing on a ton of body fat. Meanwhile, I had to just get rid of the last little bit of blueberries that I was eating because it was causing some gout-like pain in my knee, which I found out it also produces uric acid, which can contribute to
sure.
gout. Um, but these people that are getting away with it in their youth, would you say that they are going to be prime candidates for cancer in the future then?
Yeah, we can do a lot of stupid things when we're young and get away with it. And it has to do with our child rearing ages. We're producing huge amounts of glutathione, superoxide dismutase, and catalase when we're young. So we can do a lot of bad habits. You could drink a lot of beer. You, you can stay up late. You can create the anxiety of raising children and get away with it. The problem is that those habits that you generate when you're young, when all of a sudden your protector, your shield goes away, you're still keeping those same habits. And that's what eventually kills us. So the habits we generate when we're young, we're protected. We have a false sense of security. And then nature pulls the rug out from underneath of us and takes our protection away. And that's what leads to age onset death and disease. The The fructose was introduced in 1966. And the way we found this was prior to 1966, only one death out of 50 was cancer related. And prior to 1966, everybody smoked. You would have thought the cancer rate would have been higher, but it wasn't. Only 1 in 50 deaths was related to cancer. After 1966 and into the early 70s, it jumped to 1 in 3. One death out of every 3 was cancer related. So epidemiologically, we were able to go back and say, what happened in 1966? What was the game changer? And what we found was a little shocking. In 1966, Lyndon Johnson went to the USDA and said that he was cutting off the corn subsidy because he needed money. There wasn't a declaration of war to fight in Vietnam, but he needed money to fight the war in Vietnam. And the reason he was so motivated to do that was because his wife, Lady Bird, was the chief stockholder of Bell and Howell helicopters that were being built to fight the war in Vietnam. That was his motivation. So, so what happened was the USDA responded and said, you can't cut off our corn subsidies because you'll bankrupt all these farmers. So the USDA countered and said, if you allow us to convert the corn into high fructose corn syrup and introduce it into our food supply, we'll forego your subsidy because the revenue generated from that would offset the subsidy that he, as an executive in the executive branch, could now use to fight the Vietnam War with. And he agreed to that. So that became the introduction of high fructose corn syrup into our food supply. That's the primary poison. And fructose has always been a poison. Um, Biblically, you can actually go back and show that Eve ate the fruit of the apple and introduced inflammatory disease into the human race. She was forbidden to do that. Don't eat the fruit. Don't eat that apple. So she ate it anyways, and now we have inflammatory diseases that kill us all and introduce death and destruction into all of us. But hard to prove. The I went back through and calculated, for example, in an apple, most of the antioxidants in an apple are found in the peel and in the seeds. So you have to eat the whole apple to get the antioxidant properties of the apple. The problem is we
Mm.
hybridized apples. So we had an apple this big around, and that's not a natural apple. The size of the apple where the antioxidants contained within the apple offset the fructose contained within the apple means that the apple has to be less than an inch in diameter. That's the maximum sized apple anybody should eat, and you have to eat the whole apple. So what do we
So what
do?
does it mean like comparing?
Yeah. So what? How do you sell more apples? You make them sweeter. Fructose is where we get all of our sweetness from, not from glucose, not from lactose, not from maltose, fructose. So if you want to sell more apples, you make them sweeter and take advantage of our desire, human desire for sweetness. So we make Fuji apples, huge
Mhm.
amounts of fructose, very little skin, surface area to volume ratio goes down. So we don't have, you eat that apple and you've just hit yourself with a huge load of fructose. You eat enough of those apples and a doctor will visit you every day. It used to be an apple a day, keep the doctor away. Now you eat an apple and the doctor's going to be on
You're
your
going to talk.
doorstep.
Mhm.
So fruit is, I've taken practically all fruits out of my diet. I don't eat fruit. And
Same.
when fruitarians, the average life expectancy of a fruitarian is only 59 years of age. And the reason is that once they reach that age of 50, their protection ends, and very quickly, within 5 to 10 years, they'll die. So you don't see fruitarians having long lifespans. And they get very thin because they're not getting the amino acid. There's 9 essential amino acids that we're supposed to be taking. So your body will start digesting yourself, your muscle tissue, to get those amino acids. And that's why vegetarians, if their diet's not proper, they're a fruitarian because their body's digesting themselves to get those 9 essential amino acids.
Mhm.
And there's some vegans, some raw vegans that I know. Fred Bishi is one up in New York, Dr. Bishi. He's 94 years old. He was one of the original founders of the vegan lifestyle. But to watch him eat, he's eating things that have those 9 essential amino acids in them. 5 of the 9 is found in pumpkin. How many vegetarians are eating the flesh of pumpkins? Not many.
Yeah.
So 5 of the 9 essentials are in pumpkins and squash, but very few vegans eat those and eat them raw. Now, Fred Bishi is a raw vegan and has been, I don't know, 30 years, 40 years, and still in tip-top shape. He and I get into the argument on fruit quite a bit, but he can eat a lot of fruit because he's picking up a lot of antioxidants from the amount of vegetables that he's eating to offset the inflammatory response from the fruit. I hope
Mhm.
this makes sense, but it seems to be hold true.
Mhm. So it seems like we have this threshold, and earlier you mentioned how at around like 42 to 50 years old, we stop producing these antioxidants, or endogenous antioxidants like superoxide dismutase and such.
Yeah.
Is it that we stop producing it, or is it that there's a finite amount, and once we reach that threshold, we're done, we're kind of capped out?
There's about 22 different chemical steps to produce glutathione. If any one of those steps is missing, so you can't take orally glutathione. It won't make it past your stomach acid. So what you do is you take lysine. Lysine is amino acid. Lysine is what is converted into glutathione intracellular, so inside the cell. That's the only way to produce glutathione is intracellular. You can't get it through your diet. You can't get superoxide dismutase in your diet. You can't get catalase through your diet. That's just a waste of time. It sells a lot of glutathione on the marketplace, but from a practical point of view, it just gets wiped out from the 1.8 pH in the stomach. So the only thing we have is this mechanism. It's a pathway. And in one of these books back here, I can show you that pathway. But where you take in the amino acid lysine, it is moved into the cell. The cell then has enzymes that are age dependent, by the way, that will pull that lysine in and make glutathione. Or glutamine is another amino acid that's used. If that enzyme is missing, and because of your age, you're not producing that enzyme, and that's why we age, because we stop producing these little worker bees called enzymes, and we can no longer process things enough to keep us alive. So the moment we're born, we're dying, and these little enzymes are the key to that. So if you can't produce that enzyme, you can't convert lysine into glutathione. Glutathione level drops. Now your liver becomes inflamed. It kicks out a protein called a C-reactive protein. We can now measure that in your bloodstream, and that's a measure of your systemic inflammatory disease state. If I stab myself here, you would see it turn red, fester up. That's called a local inflammatory response. That's your white blood cells. Everything is coming. Neutrophils will come and try to heal that wound. My CRP probably will not go up because the
Local.
inflammation signal. There's no reason for the liver to produce that C-reactive protein, but on a local level, I can get inflammation. It turns out that the ValAsta works on local inflammation as a topical, so it'll do the same thing there. The other interesting thing is it's also an internal tanning. I don't get sunburned anymore. I can be out in the sun all I want. No more sunburns. I've had 80-year-old women, there was a group of them, I don't know what, not a flock, but a group of 80-year-old women went to Florida every year for like 60 years. And they would always get sunburned. Put all those women on ValAsta. They go to Florida. They all call back, said this is the first time in 60 years nobody got sunburned. So it does the same thing in us as it did in the algae and stops when we get exposed to UV light. The ultraviolet light will penetrate in and crack the water, the H2O, and it forms a hydroxyl free radical. That's why we get burned. It's the inflammatory response of that hydroxyl free radical as to why we respond by getting inflammation. So our body will pump fluid in to try to dilute that down. The solution to pollution is dilution. So if you're polluted with these hydroxyl free radicals, the body immediately pumps fluid in to try to dilute the problem away into your lymphatic system so it can be flushed out through your kidneys. Same thing happens with COVID or pneumonia. We get an inflammatory response from bacteria in our lungs. What's the first thing the body does is pumps fluid in, starts filling your lungs up with fluid. And that's what kills you. The COVID virus never killed anyone. It's the inflammatory response to that virus killed everyone.
Hmm. And with the inflammatory response there, because I believe that you were also in works with the Wuhan lab, if I have that correct. We don't need to go into that if you don't want to.
No, I visited it when I was there on a sludge related. I had developed technology that completely sterilized all municipal wastewater sludges. No more enteric viruses, no bacteria, so that you could take it. It's cleaner than dirt. Now you could reuse all of that organic matter back out on the fields as nutrients. Instead of taking that sludge and burying it for the next 50,000 years in a landfill, we converted it back into sterile, stable topsoil.
So was it the fact that people are already inflamed enough, so then this just like set them over the top with the inflammatory response, and like a healthy individual that doesn't have as high C-reactive protein in their um, blood measurements, that they were able to tolerate this at a much greater efficiency?
There was those who were in an inflamed state were highly susceptible to a bad outcome. Let me give you an example. I've had COVID 5 times now. First time hit me really hard, and I ended up with a blood clot hit me in the left lung. So I go into the hospital, and you know you're in trouble when you're in a room and it's all glass and nurses look in and the doctor comes in a spacesuit, and I'm going, "Oh, crap, this is not good." But he come in his suit, breathing through a scuba tank, and, I'm sitting up on the edge of the bed, and he said, "You're feeling pretty good," and I said, "Yeah," and they were supposedly able to dissolve that blood clot. I still have some damage in my left lung from it, but I said, looked at him and I said, "What's my C-reactive protein?" And he looked at me and he said, "Are you a doctor?" And I said, "No, I said, not of your type, but I said, I'd really like to know what it is." And he turned to the computer and he said, "Let's take a look." He said, "Your C-reactive protein is 23." And I went, "Oh my golly." I said, "23?" He looked at me and he said, "What do you expect it to be?" I said, "Less than 3." I said, "I'm taking this ValAsta," and I said, "It should be less than 3." He didn't have a clue as to what ValAsta was. So I s he said, "Do you know what the C-reactive protein is for people with COVID?" I said, "I don't have a clue." He said, "A good outcome is 200. A bad outcome is 1,000." He said, "We have 4 doctors trying to figure out right now why yours is 23." And I said, "Well, I can tell you why." So he come over and spent 45 minutes with me in that spacesuit. That's just the way the conversation went. And he spent 45 minutes. He looked it up on the internet and he was shocked. And he said, "We're going to look into this a little further." The next day I was released. So I was only in the hospital one night, one day, one night, and then released. And anybody who was taking ValAsta, we have no reported cases of people taking ValAsta ever having died from COVID. Zero. All the way up to age 80. Now, as we age, our inflammatory disease state increases, and we can track it now with the C-reactive protein. If you can keep your C-reactive protein under 3, you don't get the inflammatory response that could be fatal at that point.
So we've been talking about diets a little bit, and you mentioned the vegan, how he's eating vegetables with the antioxidants that are kind of counteracting and mitigating the damage that he'd be doing with the raw fruit. Now, say for instance, someone was to take ValAsta without making any type of dietary changes. They're still eating all the processed foods loaded with sodium, carbohydrates, the fructose from the table sugar. Would they still see a result taking your product?
Yeah, they would still see positive. In engineering, there's an equation: in minus out equals accumulation. So that's called a mass balance or an energy balance, but that's the equation that we would always apply in process chemical engineering. So coming in, the ROS coming in comes from all these different sources. Going out is what our antioxidant capability is to eliminate them. So if I don't want any accumulation, my out has to equal my in. Does that make sense? Okay.
Easy.
So if I keep increasing my in without increasing my out, I'm still going to accumulate free radicals that's going to overshoot the ValAsta. You can reach a point where you can't take enough ValAsta to offset bad habits. 2 puffs on a cigarette shoots your free radicals out the roof. It could take you 2 or 3 months just to recover from the inflammatory response from smoking a pack of cigarettes in one day. So it's not, you can overwhelm it. Moderation is the key. But if you know that I can not only reduce the amount of reactive oxygen species I'm putting in my diet and increase my ability to take them out, I'm going to be in great shape. That's the key. So It's like anything else. I can go drink a case of beer and suffer terribly. Um, and I probably can't take enough ValAsta to offset that over a very short period of time. But why do that anymore?
Yeah. So what lifestyle changes do you recommend to the people that do start taking ValAsta?
Uh, Meat, vegetables, periodically a potato. I stay away from red meat because I don't need the iron. I don't want to push my situation with polycythemia. It was iron dependent. So I really don't want to push that. So I manage my own health in through knowledge, through knowing that the iron and the ferritin levels I convert very readily into hemoglobin, which could really raise my red blood cell count again. I haven't experienced it, but most of the meat that I eat is chicken, fish, pork. For the last 40 years, every morning I get up, I have bacon and eggs. Have for 40 years. A very good friend of mine, Dr. Stefan Kais. You can look him up on Wikipedia. He was the inventor of the Kais coronary stent.
Hmm.
Uh, Number one cardiologist in Poland. I think number four ranked here in the US. He and I are very good friends. And he was sort of in disbelief. And he and I were on a flight together from Rome to Frankfurt, Germany. And he asked me how the ValAsta was going. And I told him, and I said, we're seeing most of our success in the arthritis realm. And he said, what type? And I said, osteo, rheumatoid, and psoriatic. All three types of arthritis we can stop. And he rolled his sleeves up. And here he has psoriasis on both arms, probably from the radiation of him doing um, athro or arteriograms, where they inject the radioactive dye into your body. He's done that for 45 years. So he's probably got some radiation exposure. So he said, how long will it take to get rid of this? I said, oh, I'd give it about 7 days. He looked at me and sat back in his seat. He says, are you telling me you'd make this go away in 7 days? He said, Sam, he said, I'm a medical doctor. He said, don't you think I've taken every drug known to mankind? And he says, you're sitting here next to me telling me you make that go away in 7 days. And I looked at it again and I said, well, I said, it might take 10. He just cracked into a smile and threw his hands in the air. And Tommy, my wife, was sitting behind me in the seat. And I said, do you have a bottle of the ValAsta? And she said, yeah. So I took it out and I gave it to him. I said, you try this. Well, he was going back to Poland, I believe. And 7 days later, Saturday night, 2 o'clock in the morning, phone rings. I picked the phone up. He said, Sam. I said, yeah. He said, this is Stefan. I said, oh. I said, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. He said, yeah. He said, I can't wait any longer. He said, I'm in Poland. He said, and these Eastern Europeans, they use a lot of curse words. And F this and F that. And he says, Sam, he said, what the F is this? And I thought he had a bad reaction because he was pretty excited. And I said, what's going on, Stefan? He said, no, no, no. Right now, he said, you tell me, what is this? So I started explaining it to him. I said, what did it do to you? He said, Sam, he said, for the first time in 42 years, I've woken up with no psoriasis. He said, what is this? So I explained it to him. Well, he flew back to the States. And he then asked me and my wife to come to the Heart Institute in San Antonio, where he runs the Heart Institute there. And I believe he teaches at Baylor. So my wife and I drive over, and he wants to do an exploratory examination of our arteries in our body. And I thought, okay, I'm 72 years old. Well, whether he kills me or I live another 5 years, or what difference does it make? So he had me a little on edge to do it from an exploratory point of view. So we go over the first day. He runs us through a stress test, does sonic testing, runs us through a pretty elaborate program. We sign our lives away that we can't sue him if we die and all this and indemnify him. So he said, Sam, he said, we'll do you in the morning and then we'll follow up with Tommy, my wife, right after you. And I said, no, no, no. I said, you do me first. If I come out of it okay, then the next day she can choose whether she wants to do it or not. And he said, okay. So I went in that morning at 6:30 and I get to watch this on a TV screen right above me. And I see the wire go in and goes up through my heart. He hits it with a dye. See all the arteries light up. And then he went up into the carotid and up into my brain. I was pretty amazed with that technology. And so I finish up. They wheel me out. I go into a recovery room. We got the curtains around in the recovery room. He came in and threw that curtain back. He said, I don't believe this. And he said, because he told us if he found something, he would fix it while we were in there. And he threw the curtain back and he said, I just don't believe this. He said, I got some good news and some bad news. He said, what do you want to hear first? I said, well, give me the good news first. He said, well, the good news is you are off the curve on all of my 50,000 patients. On the low end, you're the only patient I have at 70 years old that has no atherosclerosis, no arterial inflammation anywhere. He said, you have the coronary health of a 20-year-old. And I said, well, what's the bad news? He said, the bad news is we found a congenital heart defect. And he pulled this video up, and here I've got what's called a severe in the LAD coronary, the widowmaker artery. It's called a severe systolic kink. For my entire life, every time my heart would beat, that artery would kink, cut the blood supply off to my heart. Every time, every heartbeat, I had a heart attack. I played sports, I wrestled, I boxed, I played football. I never knew that that existed. He said, that's called a widowmaker. He said, if you'd had a blood clot hit on that heartbeat, you don't recover from that. He said that clot would have got caught in that kink. So my wife, who runs a cholesterol of 260, she goes in and he come in and told us that he would probably find something in her. And, but he said, we'll fix it. If there's any plaque formation, we'll be able to stent it and fix it. Same thing. I'm in recovery. She comes in and he comes in again and throws that curtain back. He said, I am in disbelief. He said, for somebody who's had high cholesterol for 40 years, he said, I don't have an explanation for this. He said, you will have the same coronary health as your husband. You have no atherosclerosis, no plaque buildup, nothing. He said, the only thing I can attribute it to is the ValAsta. And he called his entire staff over, all the nurses and everything there. And he said, I want every one of you on ValAsta tomorrow. He put his entire staff on it. He now prescribes it to his coronary patients. And he's seeing tremendous results. And if somebody wants to call him, they're more than welcome to call him. They can find him. His name's Radoslaw Stefan Kais on Wikipedia. But he, an amazing cardiologist. And he was shocked. But that's just one testimony. You can go onto our website, which is ValAsta.net, and look at all the testimonials of people that are there. And they were extremely skeptical. They've been battling these types of diseases for decades. And all of a sudden, in 30 days, they no longer have that disease. That's earth-shattering.
Much perfect heart health at your age.
Yeah.
Eating bacon and eggs every single morning, the things that
every morning.
Away from. Yeah.
Awesome. My wife and I both work out Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And I do weight training and aerobics, and she does aerobics, stretching, balance type stuff. We don't see many people our age working out in a gym. And I'm truly amazed. I'm holding God after Noah's flood. He promised us 120 years. I'm holding him to it.
So, with all these diseases, because it helps with the arthritis, it's helping with Parkinson's, with your cancer remission, seemingly cardiovascular health too. Would you say that there's one disease and it's just inflammation, and then it finds a way to express itself in other ways in different people?
Correct. There's one disease. It sort of reminds me of what's called the unified theory in physics. There's four forces that run everything in the universe: weak nuclear, strong nuclear, gravity, and electromagnetic. Those four forces exhibit everything you see in the universe. Only those four. In human health, there's only four: superoxide, singlet oxygen, the peroxyl, and the hydroxyl free radical. Cause all of these presented diseases. And it presents differently in the individual as to how they present with that disease. But most of the time, people who have one disease are also presenting with another. People who get cancer are also type 2 diabetic. People who are type 2 diabetic also have arthritis or neuropathy. People who have heart disease are more prone to get Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. We also developed an electromagnetic pulse device that sends a frequency, a light frequency. This was developed out of um, MIT, Dr. Li Wei Sai and her team. They're the ones, through the Picower Institute, found what causes Alzheimer's disease, and it's caused from an accumulation of an amyloid beta plaque. Well, in our brains, we have little waste management teams called microglia and astrocytes. They're not human. We don't know where they really come from, but they're in us from birth until the day we die. Typically, they're immortal. So they swing through the neuronal forest in our brain looking for debris. If a neuron dies, all the cytoplasm, the cell membrane, all the gook and the proteins in there have to be chewed up. Well, the microglia eat those. If the microglia are not active, those proteins will accumulate, and that's what causes Alzheimer's disease. It wraps around the myelin of the axon, chokes off the myelin that causes short circuits, electrical discharge too rapid, and the cell, from an energy point of view, can't keep up with that, and the cell eventually dies. The neuron dies. So, in other work that I had done on electromagnetic pulse weapons, I knew that I could send that certain frequencies through the eye, and I could change human behavior. Those weapons exist, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details on it right now, but um, the first one was deployed in the first Gulf War, where we sent light frequencies into enemy soldiers, and it stressed them, created fear and anxiety in them to the point that then we could use an auditory called an LRAD device to communicate directly to them 2 miles away, and they heard us inside their brains, inside their skull. If you've ever put on a stereo headset and got the music perfectly tuned and it sounds like the music is right directly in your head, that's what these devices can do. So we not only stressed them, created fear and anxiety in them, we then communicated in their own language that Allah wanted them to surrender. And when they turned to their other soldiers and said, "Did you hear that?" There's no visible or auditory direction at all. They just hear it inside their skull. It freaks people out. It's what was being used in the Cuban embassy back years ago, and it caused brain damage in some people. Those are the weapons that I helped develop at the Brooks Air Force Base. So I knew the frequency that I could now send through the eye. And what Li Wei Sai was doing was drilling a hole in a rat's head, inserting a fiber optic and then was activating the microglia inside the skull, intracranial, and the microglia then would eat the amyloid plaque, and the mice would relearn their mazes. Their Alzheimer's disease would go away. So I contacted them and I said, "You're not going to be able to drill holes in people's heads to do this." And they said, "No, this is not clinical." I said, "Suppose I could send that same electromagnetic pulse through the eye." And she said, "Do you have such a device?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "I own the patent to it." So we sent some devices up, and it flashes light at a certain frequency, and it goes in. And that frequency, the eye is very good at converting a photon into electricity at the same frequency. It goes back the optic nerve, and it dissipates in the occipital lobe of the brain. That energy is what activates the microglia. There's an equation: energy is equal to Planck's constant times frequency. So I can dissipate energy simply by changing the frequency that I dissipate into the brain. Well, I know what that frequency is. So we built these devices, and now we're stopping the progression of Alzheimer's. We're getting some reversal. So we can keep you from I watch it every day. Um, I, I, I have it set right next beside my TV, and I watch it for 45 minutes a day. Every light here operates at 60 hertz. In Europe, it's 50 hertz. That's the perfect frequency where we need enough energy to learn. It's very difficult to sleep because our brain is operating at 120 flashes, pulses per second. 1 hertz is equal to 2 electrical pulses. So if we're looking at 60 hertz light, our brains are flashing at 120 flashes per second. And hopefully both sides are controlled through the hippocampus so that they're both flashing at the same time. Now, if I reduce that light from 60 hertz to 20 hertz, which is 40 flashes per second, all of a sudden the microglia become active.
Oh,
So every rec center in every aged home should be operating in the rec center at 20 hertz, not 60 hertz. And they would reverse or stop the progression of the dementia associated with age onset. That
you're blowing my mind. I'm really excited that you mentioned the light. I believe you have that light product on there, but not a lot of people understand that light is an actual nutrient. Like it can also influence your hormones as
Sure.
well.
And your sleep cycle. I I just read an article on a guy who was stuck in a cave for 365 days, and he completely lost track of reality, not exposed to light, and almost to the verge of insanity. His hormone levels changed, his cortisol levels changed, his whole body. He went on a 36-hour diurnal cycle, and it really messed him up. Light's very, very important, if not absolutely crucial to our existence. Um, there's certain vitamin D, for example, comes to mind as one that is generated directly from sunlight. That's why we see most diseases happening in the December, January, February timeframe. We're not exposed to light.
Definitely.
It also explains why um, dark skinned people lived in Africa and never migrated north. Well, dark skinned people are exposed to tremendous amounts of sunlight in Africa. So their skin darkened because they didn't need that much sunlight. Well, the moment they try to migrate into the northern hemispheres, all of a sudden their vitamin D levels plunged, disease set in, killed them all. So we didn't see black migration come out of Africa. We only saw light skinned people being able to migrate with low melanin concentrations because they could absorb the sunlight, create the vitamin D, enhance their immune system, and allow them to overcome the environmental um, causation of human disease. So that's currently being studied, and it
Mhm.
turns out to be, we think, true. Um, the single largest population right now that is short vitamin D is the Black community. So they should be supplementing vitamin D year round if they're not getting enough sunlight. So sunlight's extremely important. Um,
So you mentioned that you were able to weaponize this. Uh, I don't know how much you can actually divulge here, but I don't own a television. I don't watch TV. I don't really believe anything that comes from the mainstream narrative. Um, but is it possible to weaponize light on such a mass scale where it influences people's thoughts? So you said that it was causing anxiety in these soldiers. Is it possible to influence the masses just through a television screen or a phone screen alone
it
with
is.
those same thoughts?
It's always keep in mind that equation. Energy is equal to Planck's constant times frequency. Frequency is what drives it. When I was asked to comment on the Cuban embassy, what was causing these brain concussions with the people working in the embassy? Well, that was called LRAD, and you can look this up. You don't have to believe me or anything. This is now public information. Police forces are now using it, and it was developed during, again, for the in my case, for the Iraq War, where is you if you had a group of soldiers that was, say, in a street on in Baghdad, and 500,000 Iraqis are coming down the street as a in mass. How does a group of soldiers in a Humvee, they're not carrying enough bullets to deal with that. So what they would do, and we did it with goats. I'll probably get a PETA alert, but um, this antenna would pop up on the top of the Humvee, and there was a certain frequency that would cause peristalsis in the colon. So we could make everybody defecate on command. So
Oh, okay.
it's pretty tough to riot with shit in your pants. And that's why we didn't see any riots, was because you can't stand in that sound beam for any length of time. I could shut down every school shooter that walked a hallway in a school within about 3 seconds. And when you see him walking down the hall and you have your amplifier at the end of the hall, you hit him with that, he has to drop his weapon and he's gonna writhe in agony because he can't get out of that hallway. Shoots a 30-degree beam. And he's gonna lay there screaming until somebody goes in and picks him up. You could shut every shooter down, and they will not do it. And I don't
Right.
have a good explanation as to why. I tried to buy a unit. Genesis makes the units. I tried to buy a unit from them, and they told me they had no interest in selling me one for that application. Every school system should have that capability of shutting down anybody in the hallway. It's a perfect corridor from a tactical point of view of shutting down an attacker. He's locked into the halls. Man, you've got him. You could shut him down. He couldn't fire a weapon. He'd be so disoriented. These weapons exist. They're non-lethal. Um, the electromagnetic pulse weapons were non-lethal weapons. Um, but they all exist. And why we're not exploiting those for, for these types of right applications, to me, is amazing.
I mean, I'm sure there's a reason for it. We could go down
There
the
is.
rabbit holes. I
There
mean,
is.
I've
But
read about things like MK Ultra and how like fluoride based medication. I think it was like Zoloft. How these people have suicidal thoughts or they want to kill people and such. So yeah, I'm sure there's a reason. I'm sure there's a reason.
now
Go ahead.
a DARPA and the DoD both have uh, high intensity lasers. We had them in the late 80s, plasma beam weapons, and that could shoot ball lightning in space. That's why the Berlin Wall came down. It had nothing to do with perestroika. It had nothing to do with Gorbachev. Gorbachev just knew that he had lost the ability to launch to the U.S. when Reagan put up the plasma beam weapons, the ball lightning, and the pebbles technology under the START. And I worked a little bit on that in Huntsville, Alabama. But we had a ball lightning that you couldn't use as an offensive weapon, because as soon as it came out and hit the molecules in the air, it dissipated. So you couldn't use it as an offense. That's how we got around the treaty. But in outer space, where there are no molecules of interference, you could shoot that ball lightning. It's 50,000 degrees centigrade. And when it would hit the ballistic tip of a missile, it would melt it. And in outer space, it would go hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Those devices are public knowledge. They know about them. And that's what brought down the Berlin Wall. When we launched and we showed the Soviets that we could shoot down a ballistic missile, they knew that the war was over. They couldn't launch. So they really had no choice but to do what Reagan wanted done, and that was to bring down the Berlin Wall and for Russia to give up Eastern Europe. So we won it through brute force. We run it through the threat of being able to defend against an attack. And that's why a strong military stops wars. Strong military never starts a war, as far as the U.S. is concerned. But the moment we weaken our military force, that's when the other side will start to elevate. So, and that's pretty basic, uh, from a strategic point of view, that's pretty basic understanding. And we only get in wars when we're weak. It's what happened in World War II with Pearl Harbor. It's what happened with Germany. A strong military stops wars.
Where would you say we're at now?
We're not quite there yet, but some of the technology, we have a technology advancement that nobody on the planet can compete with. All of the UFOs that people are seeing are all ours.
Of course.
Yeah. The technologies that we have with laser technology, shooting long distances off the nose of an airplane, those are high. They're now in naval ships. The technology is phenomenal. One of the ones that I got into and had the privilege of looking at was the Roswell UFO incident, 1949. And what happened there from a forensic point of view, and it all had to do with a metal called nickel titanium. And what had happened was the military had launched a stratospheric balloon with all this metal hanging off of it because they wanted to see the cold temperature effects of this metal in the stratosphere. Well, the balloon burst, and all that metal come crashing down on this guy's ranch in Roswell, New Mexico. When he got out there, it was just nothing but metal everywhere, all crumpled up and creased. And so when the rancher brought it into his house, it was cold, but he had a fireplace there, and he laid that metal in front of that fireplace, and it began to remember its previous shape. And this is metal with a memory. It's called an SMA. And I did a lot of work with it. And it began to straighten itself out as it warmed and remembered its previous shape as a flat plate, not as a crumpled up wad of metal. And it began to crawl across his floor as it moved. He freaked out. He called the radio station. And at that time, in 1949, the military was listening to every radio show. And they knew they had lost this balloon, but they didn't know where it landed. So when this rancher called into the radio station, he said, "I got something from outer space here." He said, it's alive. It's crawling across my living room floor. It's metal. I don't know what this is. Well, the sheriff comes out, then the military comes out, and they create this story that this must have come from a UFO, because we did not want Russia to know that we had developed this nickel titanium metal that we were building a space plane out of called the SR-71, the spy plane. And that's what allowed us then to fly at Mach 3 as a spy plane. It was never shot down, and high maintenance, but it was made completely out of this metal, nickel titanium. And now we've got other materials that we can use. And the next one is Dark Star, which is SR-72, and I worked on the development of high altitude fuel for aircraft that would fly in excess of 120,000 feet. So this is the technology that we now are playing with. That was in 2008. So 17 years ago, we were developing the high altitude fuel for these aircraft. Very low gel point. Typical jet fuel gel will turn solid at minus 40 degrees centigrade. We had to produce a fuel that would gel at minus 56 centigrade. So we could calculate the exact height that this airplane was going to go. They wouldn't tell us what the aircraft was at that point. We were just charged with developing the fuel for it. But it was the Dark Star SR-72 and some of the fighter aircraft that we have. And these things are flying at Mach 6. SR-72 will probably do Mach 6, Mach 7. And at 200,000 feet, by the time you launch, it's already 2,000 miles away before the missile can even get close to so it cannot be shot down.
You may be the world's most interesting man. I'm over here like, how do you find
I'm just old. James, I'm just old. You can't get through this life without absorbing something.
And that's full of adventure, so still young at heart, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, I got to wake up tomorrow and just see what the next exciting thing is that's got to come out.
And you were also part of the first AI that you sent over in your resume, which was in 1989. So the public doesn't know about all these technologies. I didn't know that AI existed back then at that time. How big of a gap do you think that there is? Do you think we're like 30 years behind what they actually have available? Technology
in 1989, I don't know whether you remember the Lotus Notes. It was a prelude prior to Excel, and it had what's called macros in it, where you could put logic, if-then type logic into the database. So we had 7 employees, and each one was responsible for his specialty in the Department of Transportation hazardous materials shipping regulations. So we had somebody that was an expert in air, moving our product by air, another one by water, marine, another one in drums, another one in full bulk truckloads, another in full drummed truckloads. So, but we had 7 people. So when a new product would come down, it would go in series to this guy. When this guy was finished filling out his document, it would go to the next guy. So from a product's inception to being able to provide that market or to provide that product into the market could take up to a year by the time you got through these 7 people and all of the regulations that had to apply to them. So I was in a polymers group, and I was asked to go over and help with the chemical distribution group in improving their logistics, their turnaround time. The business managers were complaining, and it was a big mess. So I went over and I picked their brains. I flow charted their entire process. That when this came down, what did you do first? If these criteria were all met, then what did you do? And it took me 6 months to pick these people's brains and understand from a flowchart point of view. Then I went to the macro on Lotus Notes and began to put in if this, then this, or if this, then this, and I began to build the macro. I overwhelmed the macro capability of Lotus Notes. So then I went to the management information systems, which we called MIS, and I said, I need a computer program that I could put in all of this logic, all the algorithms, of these people's knowledge into this algorithm. And they didn't have anything, but they went to a company in San Diego and they built a computer program called a shell. And a shell gave me infinite flexibility to put in if then logic and link them all. So that's what I did. I programmed that. So now when a new product came down from the business, we would punch in the physical properties of that product. And in less than 5 minutes, I had all the marketing, labeling, and packaging requirement of that product. Instead of it taking a year, it only took me 5 minutes. That product could go from inception to market in 5 minutes. They fired those 7 people. And they were friends of mine. And I'll never forget it. I got nasty phone calls. I was the reason they were terminated. And that's what AI is going to do. You either adjust or these people's positions, employment's going to go down the tubes. AI is very, very powerful. And now with what we have today versus what I was dealing with voice recognition, the ability to hear and to interpret from these algorithms, it's a much more complex, more a lot faster. When you go to things like Grok or Chat GPT, these databases search all of the knowledge of the world in seconds.
Mhm.
That's faster than the human brain could ever function. So the AI systems are going to be extremely powerful. I'm currently working with a team right now to build a propulsion system that has never been built before, and it works off of a laminar flow around an airfoil, and the equations are extremely complex. But Grok can solve those equations in seconds. We can analyze data points in medicine now, and doctors are going to be obsolete. You have, they pull a blood sample. I'm trying to get somebody to develop a device that will measure your CRP in real time, just like they do diabetes. If I could put something on there and look at that, you talk about a moneymaker, a whole business. Now everybody can measure their daily inflammatory disease state. There'll be no more chronic inflammation, no more gout, no more arthritis, no more Alzheimer's, no more dementia, all from being able to measure that CRP and keeping it under 3 milligrams per liter. I don't care what causes it. But you got to know what causes it, because if it starts to go above 3 milligrams per liter, you got to know what to cut out and what to eliminate. So when I look at things like fluoride in water, Bobby Kennedy Jr. is working on causes that cause the ROS. Okay, but you're going to affect people's lifestyles. And I recognize very quickly people aren't going to cut fruit out of their diet. They're going to want to eat fruit because they have a human desire for that sweetness. Well, I don't want to get into human desire. I want to look analytically and biochemically at what causes disease and make sure it's below the threshold. I still enjoy living. I still enjoy doing things. And so I could go have a glass of wine with my wife. But if my CRP is above 2.5, I'll forego that glass of wine and I'll sit and have a glass of iced tea. So but we have to be able to measure to control. Don't start just obliterating things as causes, because you're going to lose that battle. Because when you start interfering with people's livelihoods or things they like to do, paraquat is a classic example. We could ban paraquat. And that might be a good thing to do, because paraquat in our liver causes a huge enzymatic inflammatory response that gives us cancer. It's all inflammation. And that's what we have to be focused on. We have to change our thinking from a reactionary health system to a preventative health system. That's the transition.
What you were describing there, it made me think that you're programming yourself with an if this then that reaction. So if you see that your CRP is high, this is the decision that you want to make. So it becomes out of the equation if you want it. It's like this is what you actually need. So you
Right.
can go against it,
Yeah.
but you're just playing with fire at that point.
Yeah. And in life, it's the same thing I ran into with the AI systems. It's not just one variable. So you have one variable doing this over time, you have another one doing this. As time progresses, so you're looking for optimum levels, and you want to maintain an optimum level within your life operating envelope. You get outside that envelope, you'll die. So there is a homeostasis, an equilibrium that we're allowed to operate within. We can have spikes in anxiety. We can have spikes in fear. We can have spikes where we eat a huge amount of fruit or drink alcohol, get a hangover. But as long as we don't cross outside that operating envelope, we'll stay alive. But you can drink enough that'll throw you outside that operating envelope and you'll die. You can eat enough sugar that it will kill you. You can drink enough water, it will kill you. So everything's a poison. Just so we can get energy to carry on with our life. Everything's a poison.
Mhm.
But some of them, when we look at the byproducts, we have to generate urine. I don't see people drinking their urine. Urine's a waste product that is necessary for us to produce so that you and I can have this conversation. It's a game of optimization.
Now, with the optimization, since you brought up cancer again, and I want to go into electric because that's one thing that stuck out to me before. I've read your patents with the ValAsta product, and you mentioned in there that the electrical potential of the cell is different with a cancerous cell. So, would you mind explaining that, and then also
Sure.
how your product helps resolve that issue?
Sure. Um, Cancer lives in an acidic environment. Anything that has to do with alkalinity will kill a cancer cell. But on the electro potential of those cells, think of it as if I have a charge outside of a membrane and a charge inside, I have a plus and a minus separated by an insulating material. I now have created what's called a potential. Every human cell has excess sodium ions on the outside and potassium ions on the inside of a cell, and it's called a sodium potassium pump. For one molecule of ATP, we can pump 2 or 3 molecules of sodium out of the cell, and we can bring 2 potassium inside the cell. So the concentration difference between those two metals, sodium and potassium, which are metals, by the way, creates an electric charge. It's called the Seebeck effect. In physics, we use it in thermocouples, two dissimilar metals. I developed it to a point where I could generate electricity on the moon with two dissimilar wires, one exposed to sunlight, the other ends in shade and cold. This was the basis of the thermoelectric generators. So as long as this end is hot and these two down here are in the cold, I end up with an electric potential. And I could generate electricity with no moving parts on the surface of the moon simply by using the hot side of the moon, and the sheet in between would create the shade. So on the hot side, it's 460 degrees Fahrenheit. In the shade, it's minus 270. So I had almost a 700-degree temperature difference that is the same as a flame of burning coal. And I could generate electricity from that with no moving parts. It was a very, very simple project to work with. Our cells work the same way, except we have sodium metal on the outside of our phospholipid membrane, and potassium on the inside. That generates 70 millivolts per square meter. 70 millivolts per square meter. Now, when I multiply that by, let's say I wanted to produce something that was one square meter. That's the equivalent of 143 million volts on a large scale. So for cells, they're very, very small. We're only looking at 70 millivolts. But if I expanded that electric potential up to a solar cell with the same sodium and potassium separated by a membrane, I could generate 143 million volts per meter. Now, this is the basis for another technology we're developing called ultracapacitors, because ultracapacitors use that same concept, and that's what we're developing right now. But that's another whole discussion. So let me give you an example. So we have a high concentration of potassium inside the cell. Let's take this as the cell. Inside the cell, we have high potassium. Outside here, we have high sodium. If we increase our sodium content and by diffusion force more sodium inside the cell, the electric potential across this membrane decreases. Vice versa, if I increase the potassium concentration outside the cell, this electrical impulse will cease. Now, in lethal injections, we're going to kill somebody on capital punishment. The person is operating with a high, in the cell structure in the heart, a high potassium concentration here, low potassium, high sodium on the outside of the cell. That creates electric discharge that fires the muscles, makes the muscles contract, makes the heart beat. Now, when I inject somebody intravenously with potassium, and I increase the potassium concentration outside this cell to equal the concentration that's inside this cell, all electrical activity stops, the heart stops. That's how we put people to sleep. So the importance of maintaining that balance is crucial. Now, as sodium is leaked into a cancer cell, because cancer cells will absorb more sodium inside because their sodium potassium pumps are not functioning properly. It's a defect of cancer cells. Our bloodstream operates at a pH of 7.35. The pH of sodium in water is 7, slightly acidic, more acidic than our blood. Anything below 7 is acidic, anything greater than 7 is alkaline. So the more sodium that a cancer cell takes in, the lower the pH. It approaches that acidic 7 pH. This is why our blood pH cannot change 7.35 to maybe 7.4. If it gets down to 7.3, you're in trouble. If it gets to 7.45, you're in trouble. So we cannot drink alkaline water and expect it to have an effect on a cancer cell in our body because it can't get past the pH of the blood. It will be regulated at 7.35. But cancer cells, when they produce these hydroxyl-free radicals, the hydroxyl-free radical has a pH of 5.2, which is acidic. That acidic environment around a cancer cell lives in, and it kills adjacent cells, and that's what makes space for the tumor cell to grow. Now, that hydroxyl-free radical having a pH of 5 with a 0 charge, it's missing an electron, and it's looking to capture an electron. So when we feed it astaxanthin, cancer cells love the glucose attached to the astaxanthin, the glucosidic. It's called a Trojan horse, and we did this in bioweapons development. So when the cancer sees that sugar, it says, I want that sugar, pulls it in, but it carries in with it the astaxanthin because it's chemically attached. The cancer cell cracks the glucose off and uses it for energy. Now the astaxanthin is intracellular. It's inside the cell. That astaxanthin can now donate an electron to the OH zero charge, and it becomes an OH minus one. It has one extra electron. Electrons are always negative. So it's got one extra electron. So it's an OH minus one. A hydroxyl, it converts it into an ion. A hydroxyl ion has a pH of greater than 12. Shoots the pH inside the cancer cell. The cell membrane of the cancer cell saponifies because of the alkaline nature of that. And the cancer cell ruptures and dies in 4 seconds. That's how ValAsta.
Hmm. So it's not restoring the membrane potential, it's killing the cancer cell.
Yeah, ValAsta kills the cancer cell, but cancer cells themselves will accumulate sodium and try to create an acid environment so that it can kill adjacent normal cells that are operating at 7.35 to make room for it to grow.
It sounds like the standard American diet, because if I was to go in a grocery store and pick up a box of processed food, whatever it may be, if you look at it, it's very high in carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are going to break down into glucose, and then they also load it with sodium too. There's no potassium generally added to any of these processed foods. So it sounds like a recipe for cancer by consuming
It
any of those.
is. It is. The higher you make the sodium concentration outside the cell, and sodium really likes to be dissolved in water. So if the sodium concentration gets very high, it will diffuse into the cell through what's called concentration gradient. The concentration's so great here that even this high concentration potassium can't keep the sodium out. Now, to dilute the sodium inside the cell, guess what the cell does? It pumps fluid in to try to dilute the sodium concentration. That's why we get swollen feet in diabetics. That's why we swell up when we take too much sodium in. That's what causes it. And it's trying to flush out the sodium and get it to the kidneys. And if your kidneys aren't working properly, and this stays high in sodium, the electrical activity for you to function properly with your muscles, because the sodium concentration's increasing here to equal what's out here, the electrical activity diminishes. So now you get lethargic, your muscles don't work properly. So from a biochemical point of view, that's what's going on. So keep sodium levels. Potassium levels are much harder to retain than sodium levels. So if you are losing potassium, which in elderly people, we have a tendency to lose potassium very rapidly, you're much better to take a potassium supplement. Some people who have AFib are short either potassium or magnesium. Those are 2 key elements that keeps the electrical activity on your heart stable and allows you to keep pumping regularly. If that sodium and potassium balance gets out of line, you get this fa-bump, 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 fa-bump. You get into that irregular heartbeat and potentially into AFib. But it's usually a sodium-potassium imbalance.
Hmm. So I know high carbohydrate diets too, they're going to make you retain more sodium as well. Would you be able to just take that potassium supplement and then be fine with it? I was taking some potassium supplements at a period, and I was kind of tinkering. I was the N01 here with the doses. It would have been like a 1-to-1 potassium to sodium ratio, 2-to-1, or 3-to-1. But I stopped messing around with it because I noticed that it would make me feel leaner, tighter, but then it also felt like I was dehydrated from the inside, almost like I could not get fully hydrated. It
You
was as if
you
I was
couldn't
in a
drink
desert.
enough water. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sodium
So I
is what
stopped messing.
drives hydration. So when you sweat a lot and sodium is the first thing that goes out in your sweat. Potassium is the first thing systemically that you discharge through your kidneys. So when you sweat a lot, that the metal ion that's in the sweat is sodium. You get very, very dehydrated. You can't retain water without sodium. And that's why we really are salt creatures. Um, but you can reach a point where you've sweat a lot, and then if you take potassium, now you're in trouble because your potassium concentration out here is increased because you've decreased the sodium level. The potassium level in here, they become equal, and electrical activity to all your muscles and your heart will stop. So you got to be careful with getting dehydrated because you can reach a point of no return. And by the time you feel yourself thirsty, it's probably too late. You've got to
Yeah.
stop. No more muscle activity. You've in your body, your brain will knock you down. You truly will pass out. But usually, what goes first, we see in marathon runners, their legs give out. The big muscles in our legs will collapse because they have no more electrical activity, and you just slump over and you wonder, "Oh my golly, what's going on here? I can't get my legs to work." Well, that's why you've just wiped out that electric potential.
Yeah, it was
Interesting.
quite scary when I was dabbling with that type of stuff. D Since you were mentioning you're looking into a device that can measure your CRP just by, like, your fingertip or something like that, is there a way to measure electrolyte balance easily, like, non-invasive? Because I don't even think blood tests are the best way to go for that, for electrolyte profiles, is it?
It is right now. Um, I I'm not aware of a diagnostic tool that we can use to measure those. Um, a lot of people like to look at pH of urine. Urine has nothing to do with your bodily blood pH. It has absolutely nothing to do with it. Um, all that pH is doing is measuring how to get rid of hydrogen ions versus hydroxyl ions, the plus ions or the negative ions. So your urine pH can change dramatically, but your blood pH can never change. So don't ever use thinking you're acidic or you're alkaline simply from your urine test. And that we can check just with a stick. Um, to test electrolytes without a blood test, I don't know of a tool that does that. So, from an analytical or medical tool concept, it would be worth having these devices, especially if we're getting into AI systems. We got to be able to measure what we're doing or our current state, and then now we have this entire AI intellect that can take those key numbers, just like I took the chemical properties of a product, and in 5 minutes diagnosed how to get it into the market. We can do the same thing if we can measure everything on a real time basis. The AI system will tell you within seconds what you're imbalanced in, what you need to eat for the next day. I mean, we could get down to that level of detail. And that's what's going to happen in the next 30 years, by the
What fields do you feel like are actually safe then?
way. Oh man. What field do I think? Um, somebody's got to maintain these systems. So, and it's all electrical technician, mechanical builders. They have to be built. Human beings still have to be able to supervise and fix things. That's what we're going to be. Um, that's what we're going to evolve into. Is human beings are just going to serve the machines.
That's what I was gonna say. Crazy.
That's the reality of it. But we enjoy life. We have a very key component of consciousness and an element of life that allows us to enjoy life more than machines can enjoy. Machines can't enjoy anything. It is strictly if then with a machine. If then. For us, it might be if then, but we can rationally go do something different. We're not locked in as a living conscious entity to actually behaving from the output of an if then logical statement. We We have a conscience. We get to choose. Machines are not going to have the ability to choose other than look at the highest probability, like in quantum computing. What's the most likely outcome of that? And we can argue that maybe that's how our brains work too, and we don't even know it. Maybe we're analyzing what is the most likely outcome of it and make a rational decision from that point.
Hmm.
But
So
we're headed
is AI actually capable of learning, or is it strictly just based off of whoever programmed it with those if then or if this then that equations?
it's capable of learning within the shell of how it was programmed, the environment in which it was programmed. So the shell that I used back in 1988, that concept is still there. So if someone wants to go in and program a robot to learn, because they can still learn within the shell. But what is happening is the shell is being defined by human beings. And the
Hmm.
intent of that human being defining that shell dictates the capacity of it to learn. That's the problem. Um, we don't have the AI systems developing their own rational shells yet.
Hmm.
But
I
human
mean, I
beings,
guess like all the doom and gloom movies like iRobot or Terminator, you don't think it'll ever get to that point where they can actually breach outside the shell and develop their own conscious awareness?
the conscious awareness in a machine is based on the number of probable solutions to its algorithm. Um, one of the, th- I mean, this is really coming into a point of um, a philosophical, ethical discussion as to where religion plays, for example, in our thinking, where environmentalism plays. What is belief? What is a guess? What is a religion? Um, we've struggled with that as human beings, and machines are going to look at what is the outcome of what it is I'm trying to do, and what's the most optimal way of getting there. Now, I can envision machines learning to the point of having access to all of the available data of the known universe or here on Earth and making rational decisions based on either consensus, which is only 51% being right, versus a theory, which you have to be 97% correct, only 3% failure for a theory, or a law, which requires 100% accuracy all the time. If I drop an apple 100 times it'll hit the floor. That's a law of gravity. So laws are 100% effective. They have never been known to be violated. Theories are only about, we run them out to 3 sigma, which is 97% accurate, 3% failure. Space flight, for example, has to have an REID, which is risk of imminent injury or death of less than 3% before we would ever launch. That's why the space shuttle got shut down. That's why we can't go to Mars. Right now, the REID for going to Mars is greater than 6. No one will survive going to Mars. And we've known that since the Artemis uh, program in 1994. So, how seriously do we act on a consensus? How much confidence do we act if it's a theory, 97% of being right, versus a law where you will be right 100% of the time. We've got to get AI systems to move from what is a consensus, because there's a lot of error in there and you get a lot of people killed if you're only 51% correct. And as engineers, we would never operate at that level.
Mhm.
Engineers have to operate at a 97% success rate. We have to be right 97% of the time. Only 3 engineers out of 100 will ever go to jail. That's sort of the way we look at it. We build bridges, we do chemical operations, we run refineries. Every refinery could blow up at any moment, but they operate at 97% capability. There's only 3 types of error: willful, inadvertent, or lack of technique. Every single action or failure in human existence can be brought back to those 3 types of errors. AI knows what those 3 errors are. A terrorist is a willful error. Fortunately, that only happens about less than 0.5% of all failures are willful. There's an inadvertent. I'm driving a forklift. Oh man, my girlfriend and I just had a fight. I know what to do. I know how to pick that pallet up and move it somewhere else. But I picked the pallet up and I got diverted by some other thinking and I dumped the pallet. The whole warehouse came crumbling down. That's called an inadvertent error. Then there's a lack of technique error. Lack of technique is the person didn't know. He just wasn't educated enough to know. Every single failure in every error analysis I've ever done or forensic study I've ever done is brought back to those 3 types. And once you identify the type of error, it's easy to find a solution. Can AI systems decipher those 3 aspects for failure mitigation? And that's where we get into rational thought. Human beings can take risks. I'm not so sure that, because an AI system is going to want to be right 97% of the time. We will gamble, and but we have a consequence. There's no feeling of consequence in a machine. There's not a conscience there.
Mhm.
And that's what's helping me to try to come to terms with what does consciousness really mean. Just because he knows how to do things isn't really consciousness. That's
Yeah.
just, he knows. If he knows, what in that machine would drive him to do otherwise? Why would, if that computer analyzed everything analytically the way that he's programmed to do that, what in that machine would then say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this over here? Love has a problem with that. We can fall in love with a damn criminal who, when he gets out of jail, will probably murder us or kill us, and yet we still fall in love with him. A machine would never do that. A machine would say, "Oh no, I'm not going to eliminate my my existence." So I don't know. To answer your question, I just don't know. But the potential is there,
Mhm.
and it's going to cost a lot of jobs. It's going to create panic in some areas, um, and it's going to end up with us serving those machines. When the machine breaks down, we get to go in and either build a machine to repair it. I'm out on an excavator yesterday, and I'm running the excavator digging a hole. I can never dig that hole as a human being, but my excavator is a robot, and I'm
Mhm.
servicing that robot to dig that hole. He can't think. He doesn't know what he's going to bang into a building or anything else. All he knows is that as I'm manipulating that, all the power is coming from that excavator. And I'm just serving the function of the excavator. It's sort of a sickening way of looking at the value of human beings, but I had that feeling come across me. I'm just a service provider.
I didn't mean to actually like go into this whole philosophical thing, but it just came up. I feel like you were the person to ask, and you went into consciousness there. And I'm curious what the future is going to hold when people may meet this time period where they struggle to find a lack of purpose or meaningful work. So if we're just servicing the machine, if we've kind of gotten a touch, we're not really in tune with nature, we're not in tune with our intuition, which is already apparent in many people. What is the meaning of life at that point? How do we find fulfillment? How do we find happiness?
I hunt
You don't have
dinosaurs.
to answer
Yeah, yeah.
that.
I hunt. All I could do is answer from my perspective.
That was
But
good.
I chose to create. I chose to take the advantage, I guess, that I have, or the tools that I have, and I find purpose in taking a brain fart and converting it into something of reality. All the patents were based on a thought, an abstract thought. And that's a great question, James. I mean, you're going to have me waking up in the middle of the night thinking about this now. What is the purpose when all purposes are meaningful purposes? Or there, there's four things that cause people to function. It's motivation, it's discipline, it's um, uh, perseverance, and it's execution. Those four things are driving towards a purpose. But if I don't have a purpose, what difference does it make if I'm motivated? What what you've hit something that's going to be very, very difficult as we go into the next decade, even 10 years. This is going to be a problem. Where do people find value? Where do people the one common element in human beings is they must be relevant. If
Mhm.
they lose that sense of relevance, and we see it in school shooters, we see it in criminals, they have no value, no personal value. So how do you maintain relevance in human beings that have no reason to provide anything?
Mhm. There's a book that I have. I haven't finished it. It's called Technological Slavery, and it kind of got into these dark, twisted thoughts. And there's another one called the Zen Art of I can't find it right now, but motorcycle maintenance, where it's like we're running away from something that we can't put a name to, and it just brings kind of this thought up right now.
Right. James, there's a book I wrote. It's on Amazon. It's called uh, uh, Live Your Life Fearlessly, The Journey of a Stoic Christian. And it's a compilation of the last 40 years of things that I observed. I kept a diary, a journal for 40 years. And everybody I would meet, I would write down what I learned from that person. So I would sit and dwell for maybe an hour or so. What did that person teach me? Well, a couple years ago, I gave it to a lady who was having problems with her drug addicted son. And she read through it and she said, "You need to publish this." And so I did. And it's on Amazon, but um, it deals with a lot of these things. What is our purpose? There's only two rules and it's sort of an ultra truism, but there's only two rules to living things have over inanimate objects. The first one is everything you do for yourself. You do for self to maximize your pleasure or minimize your pain. Every decision you make, so if we get into if then, every decision a human being makes is broken down to those two rules. Every living creature will do it in a self-interest. The second rule is every living creature will tend to maximize his pleasure or minimize his pain. A leaf on a tree will turn to the sun to maximize its photosynthetic power. Every decision we make, and where I got to, it was a guy I worked with, John McHugh. He was a decorated World War II veteran. He comes up to a hedgerow in France with his platoon. He's got 23 men under, and they burst out of this hedgerow, and a German machine gun opens up on him across a 100-yard field and kills all 23 of his men. He's the only one left alive. And he looks down the line, and they're all dead. And he said he laid there. He couldn't live with the pain of having lost all of his men. And he jumped up and raced across this 100-yard field with machine gun bullets hitting all around him. The other soldiers are watching him do this. Machine gun bullets hitting all around him. They never hit him. He jumps in the foxhole, kills 2 Germans, and hand-to-hand combat with the other one, kills 3 Germans in that machine gun nest. And then the Allied troops come across the field, and they look in the hole thinking he's dead. And he's laying in there on top of these 3 German bodies. And he's just looking up at him, and the colonel got him up out of there, and he ends up being a decorated war hero. And I asked him, I said, John, I said, whatever made you do that? He said, it's like sitting in the balcony of a movie theater. And I now know where it comes from, shock. But he said, I watched myself doing this. I was out of my body watching myself run across this field. And he said, there was no bullets hitting me. I couldn't feel anything. And it was as if I was watching it play out. And he said, but I couldn't live with the pain of having lost my troops. And I had to take them out. Even the pain of him dying wasn't as bad as him losing those troops. And that's what really made me think, this is why people act heroically. They put themselves in a position of their inability to act is going to result in such pain that they will take whatever it is to get them through. You look at crucifixion. Why in the world did Christ get up on a cross when he could have taken himself down off of it? Well, he knew. Why do people jump in front of cars to rescue small children? Because the pain, especially in men, of knowing that child is going to get run over and killed is greater than me losing my life to save that child. So it's an ultra truism point of view, but I wish I knew what truly drove human beings. There's something inherent in us that isn't and truly in life, whether we're talking about a fish, a frog, a leaf, a buffalo. What makes a buffalo run away from a wolf? It doesn't know anything about death. Why do
Mm.
it's just something inherent in us, and we may never know the answer. But I'd like your shirt, back to human.
Uh-huh.
That's it.
Thank you. Hopefully conversations like this, granted, I don't want to live in a dystopian future where we are just serving machines, but the point of having these type of conversations is to remind us of what's here. I believe that we all have an innate ability to heal. I believe that God has gifted us with that. I believe that life was not meant to be full of pain and suffering at all times, and certainly not with these chronic diseases, which I believe are very, maybe not mentally easily resolved, but I believe that there is a much higher quality of life that people can experience, and that's why I'm very glad that I was able to get you on the show today and have this type of conversation, uh, despite it kind of taking a detour. But these are the organic conversations that I really love to have, and there's just so much that you've done. It would be impossible to have it all in just one episode. If you're open to it, I would love to have you back on to dive a little bit deeper into these topics.
Yeah.
The one question that I want to bring it back to your product, ValAsta, because it's an antioxidant, and I want to know, how does it differ from other treatments such as like uh, high dose vitamin C in IV therapies, or even like vitamin E? What makes it different than these other antioxidants?
A very good question, and it took us a long time to figure it out. But all the major vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin A, vitamin B, vitamin D, niacin, they all have to be metabolized. When you ingest those, they're metabolized in the liver, and they become what's called pro-oxidant. That's why low dose vitamin C becomes sort of beneficial. High dose vitamin C can actually be inflammatory and cause non-cirrhosis, cirrhosis of the liver. So, so they start out as an antioxidant, but during the metabolism to digest those and to get them out of your system, they become pro-oxidant. Pro-oxidants are easily manipulated by the enzymes for wasting. ValAsta is the only one that we know of right now that it does not convert into a pro-oxidant. So that's the major difference, in that we don't see any downside and no side effects from taking the ValAsta, because it doesn't result in a negative hydroxyl formation or an inflammatory disease state, whereas all these others do. And that's a problem. It's not necessarily the more you take, the better you're going to be. Like vitamin C, there is an optimum. If you go too far over, it can be just as deadly a poison as if not taken. So you got to be very, very careful. People who do ozone is a free radical. Why would you that's like chemotherapy. It increases your inflammatory disease state in hopes that your immune system gets heightened to recognize the cancer cell. Well, cancer cells can hide in what's called a PD-L1 ligand. So Dr. Allison won the Nobel Peace Prize on this in 2018 or 2019. And he identified how cancer cells defend against our immune system. Cancer is not a parasite. Parasites have different DNA than human beings. Cancer is you. Cancer has your DNA in it. It is not a parasite. But the way it works is cancer will push out through its cell membrane these ligands called a programmed death ligand 1. And normal cells have them too, but cancer cells have hundreds of times more typically of these ligands that stick out through the cell membrane. So when your T cell comes down and it searches every single cell in your body looking for debris, bacteria, whatever that it can eat, well, it has a PD-1 on it. If the PD-1 comes down to, let's say, to a normal cell, and it makes contact with the PD-L1 of the normal cell, your immune system runs away. It won't kill it. So in cancer cells, which have 100 times more of these PD-L1s, our immune system comes down, makes contact, and runs away. Will not kill that cancer cell. It recognizes it as a normal human cell. So what the astaxanthin does on the keto functionality of the astaxanthin, it will stick to the end of the PD-L1. So now I have this astaxanthin molecule stuck to the tyrosine terminus end of the PD-L1. Keytruda operates this way. Opdivo operates this way. Yervoy operates. They're called immunotherapy drugs. So it sticks like this. Now, if it's stuck on the end of that PD-L1 and the T cell comes down, it can't make contact with that PD-L1 and it kills that cancer cell in 4 seconds, recognizes it as a foreign body and kills it. So we got 2 mechanisms of kill with the ValAsta. The first one is as a PD-L1 inhibitor. The second one is by changing the pH from an acidic environment to an extremely high alkaline environment intracellular to the cancer cell, inside the cancer cell. So and cancer cannot handle a two-flanked attack. That's why we're so effective, we believe, in killing cancer. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not, but
Yeah.
okay.
How are your clients taking this? Because I see that you have like either chocolate or it looks like a liquid.
Yeah, we have it in oil, a pump bottle oil with capsules, so you can fill your dose however you want to fill it. And so that's one. So we have people who are actually fine-tuning their dose. So you can get up to 3 pumps per capsule if you fill them yourself. You can do 1 pump per capsule, 2 or 3, depending on where you want to be. Each pump is 13.5 milligrams. So we can get about 40 milligrams in 1 capsule if you fill that capsule up. Then we have pre-capsulated, because if you get that oil on you, it is so electrostatic, it will go everywhere. I've had a drop get on my finger and continued working, and pretty soon it's on my forehead, it's on the walls, it's just whatever it touches. It actually gets down inside the fingerprints. It's like rubbing a balloon on your hair and sticking it on the wall. It's that kind of static charge that this material happens, and that's what makes it so effective. So we have it but you gotta be careful what you're doing. You don't want we have capsule holders and the little spout on the pump, and you can fill the capsules yourself and be very careful. We didn't like it with elderly people, and that's typically who our patients or clients are. So we decided to go capsule it. So we ended up with a company that can encapsulate it without high temperature, because I didn't want temperature to inactivate the astaxanthin. So we have it in a capsule form too. And I thought maybe so we have it in liquid form that you can also use and put on wounds, put saran wrap around it, and the next day it will kill whatever infection is there. So it's a pretty good anti-inflammatory there. So we have liquid, we have capsules, we have it in chocolate, which I developed from my mother, who was a type 2 diabetic for 48 years. And she passed away at 93. But she had gone into the doctor, and the doctor told her that she was going to lose her kidneys from the diabetes. And I told her, I said, you need to be on ValAsta. She said, well, I don't like the oil. I said, well, what do you like? She said, I like chocolate. So I decided to make up a batch, put it in chocolate, and I made her giant chocolate bars. And I gave it to her, and it cured her of her renal failure. She went from 29% kidney function up over 50 within 30 days after being on ValAsta. And she died at 93 in a fall. Had nothing to do with her type 2. She was no longer a diabetic. But she wouldn't tell the doctor that she wasn't diabetic, because she wanted the insulin, because she wanted to get up every morning and eat 2 or 3 donuts. And she used the insulin, and I didn't. I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "You can't do that. You run this tendency of being, well, I can just offset it by shooting myself up with insulin." I mean, that's the wrong thing to do, but it was hard to convince her.
Mhm.
But that's the primary ways of doing it. We also have it in dog food, horse pellets, um, Let's see if there's anything else on there. We have it in creams. We have it with DMSO, which is pretty interesting also. Carries it deep within the dermal tissue for lesions or sores with cancer outbreaks.
And you'd say, because you're the one that came up with this and you were eating the algae, that it'd be pretty much impossible for anyone to get this through nutritional means, these doses.
You can't get these doses. You'd have to eat 2.5 pounds of salmon every day just to equal the minimum dose. 1,200 quarts of blueberries. Um, it's the most powerful antioxidant on the planet. Let me give you everyone's familiar with curcumin or turmeric. Um, they have what's called an ORAC score, which is oxygen radical absorption coefficient score, and that's how we measure the antioxidant properties of these compounds. Of about 120,000, pretty high. Dark chocolate is 20,000. So turmeric's a pretty good antioxidant. ValAsta is 2.2 million, 20 times more powerful than turmeric. No reason to take those compounds at all for the antioxidant properties that ValAsta can give. The only other material we've been able to find, which is about 2.4 million on an ORAC score, is what's called dragon's blood. It's a sap that comes out of a tree in the Amazon. And it's not commercially available, but it has a huge antioxidant property associated with it also.
Would you say that pretty much everyone should be taking this as almost a preventative then?
I would the first thing I would do is see where you are, set a baseline, find where your HSCRP is. If it's less than 3, I wouldn't take it. If it's greater than 3 and you're wanting to combat it, yeah, I would. I would.
Yeah. And is there like a protocol that you have for certain
There is.
ailments?
There is. We have nurses that can step you through it, depending on the disease, the state of your disease, your body weight. Um, that would be the best way to do it.
So last question I have for you, brother. Uh, where can people find you and your product? Are you on social media at all?
I'm on Facebook, but I would prefer if they're wanting to talk to go through the office. There's ValAsta.net is the website, and then the telephone number is 803-470-1913. And they can set up consultations. Um, if these people are really at the end of their rope, and those are the ones that we have to let them know that there is hope, there is an alternative. They need to try this and not give up because the success rate, you'll see it on the testimonials. Some of these people are stage 4, 2 months into their stage 4. And in 30 days, they were cured. It is the most remarkable thing I've ever worked on in my life. I've been on both ends of developing weapons and this is by far way above morally and ethically the right thing to do. And in so doing, we were sort of given the light that, oh my golly, this is health changing forever. It's given us a whole new direction of healthcare and on the prevention side of this, not just in the treatment of symptoms. So it's going to create a lot of panic in the healthcare industry. But I think we're at a state where we need to create some panic in the healthcare industry. Get
Mm,
back. Our
absolutely.
bodies can heal ourselves.
Hmm.
We're our
Absolutely
own
agree.
worst enemy.
I absolutely agree, brother. I know we have the whole Maha movement now, make America healthy again.
Yeah.
I personally don't think that we should be waiting on any politician to be doing that for us. I think that
No,
it
but they'll
is
stop
within our
you.
control.
They'll do everything they can to stop you. And that's something that we have to just keep pushing forward. I'm a huge proponent. I know how ivermectin works. I know how hydroxychloroquine works. those were antiparasitics, but they deal with the same microtubule that cancer cells, the same characteristic in a cancer cell is a huge concentration of these microtubules that are also found in parasites. Ivermectin works the same way. It will disrupt that microtubule structure inside a cancer cell, and that's why it kills cancer. And the NIH has now just shown that. So I take ivermectin, I take ValAsta. I don't eat fruit. I eat bacon and eggs every morning. I'm going to do my best, and God will do the rest.
Love it, brother.
That's it.
All right, my
Take
friend.
care,
Thank you
James.
again for this. Thank you for your wisdom, brother. Hope you have a great day.
You too. Bye bye.